There are some pages in my D&D books that are practically worn out with how often I refer to them, and others that I could gladly toss overboard. But when asked at a Q&A recently which pages in the 2014 books I would rip out and remove in order to make space in 2024, I'll admit that I was surprised by how little really stood out. At different experience levels, some pages have more or less value. Mostly, I'd like to see a streamlining of the material that's in there rather than things being ripped out and removed. But if I had to remove a couple of things, then if I was starting in the PHB, I would say that appendices B through D could go. Creatures was needed in 2014 because of the release cycle, but doesn't really serve the same purpose now with so much material available for the 5th edition. I think that we could tear that out without it causing undue strain on anybody in running the new version of the book, and the slight advantage that it gives you to be able to refer to the beasts for wild shapes is probably not worth the page count if there's something exciting that we could throw in there instead. Similarly, I think that the Gods of the Multiverse was really more of a DMG item anyway, and very specific to different settings. And we could, again, get away with removing those couple of pages and putting the gods into the various setting books and encouraging players to go there for that information. Likewise, the planes of existence are pretty much straight up just Dungeon Master's Guide material, and I'm not really sure why those made it into the player's handbook in the first place, as depending on your cosmology of choice, it's a little bit confusing and unnecessary. In the DMG, there's only a couple of things that I would remove, the first of which would be villain class options. While I know that it is a fairly strong holdover from older editions to create bad guys as NPCs using the player character rule set in order to build them out, in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the math just doesn't really hold out to make that a worthwhile method of creating a character. While it does give you options for your villains in terms of their ability options and their action economy, it does very, very little to add nuance and depth to them by comparison to simply designing a cool villain on a monster stat block with a handful of player options thrown in. The class options for villains I have far more frequently seen as a requested item for the players because the DMG items had a little bit more oomph than the player versions of the same class options, which is obviously not an intended power creep thing that they put in there, but was the result of putting it in there. The other one is the rules for chases in 5th edition, which, though I have found them to be useful for running races, need tons of work to make them an interesting chase scene option that resolves the problem of monster wants to run away, but we want to catch them, or vice versa. That just needs a complete revamp, and so ripping that out and replacing it with something else would definitely work for me. In the monster manual, there's not a lot that I would remove because it's pretty much just a block full of specific creatures, and there are specific creatures that I would say would be worthwhile removing, but really I would rather, again, see them revamped to be unique and interesting rather than actually pulling them out of there in any meaningful way. I think that if you're pulling out creatures, you could pull out pretty much anything that's just multi-attack and a bag of hit points with some minor features that don't really add any gameplay element, like, say, the owlbear. I would be happy to see monsters like that torn out in favor of making space for creatures that have interesting options or unique attacks or abilities or defenses that give us some interesting gameplay instead of just a bag of hit points with an armor class and a bunch of attacks to return damage back to the players. The boredom factor of those monsters makes them worth pulling out. I would also love to see a shift in the NPCs, no longer just putting them all in the back and having specific types of NPC that are so hyper focused down to a specific creature and don't cover the range and breadth of CR, and instead having, like in Musing Design's Essential NPCs on DM's Guild, a individual monster archetype, an NPC archetype, that you can then have a range of CRs all the way from the lowly 1/4 up to a CR 20, so that when you want a guard for the elite guard, it doesn't have to look the same as a guard for the city militia, and anywhere in between is a possibility and an option available to you as well. Creatures that have neat abilities and vulnerabilities should fill the monster manual. And I think that making space for those, if it's necessary, just means getting rid of the boring ones or just editing them and making them more fun. I'm afraid this wasn't a very satisfying answer because there really just wasn't a bunch to get rid of, but I appreciate the question and wanted to circle back and finish it out. If you have any questions that you would like to see answered in depth or on the fly, then don't forget to drop in a question at our Q&A for the month, and I'll do my best to answer as best I can. Thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.